This week, I'll be joined by some of our CBN News reporters to examine some of the significant events in 2021 that occurred here in Israel and the Middle East, and the impact those events could have on the future. From the Israeli election that unseated Israel's longest-serving prime minister to the escalating war of words between Israel and Iran and the disastrous U.S. pullout from Afghanistan, it's been a turbulent year. Still, there were highlights like the one-year anniversary of the Abraham Accords. Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl and senior editor John Waggy join me in our Jerusalem studio. John and Julie, thanks for joining me on the Year in Review program. A lot of momentous and even historic events and developments have taken place here in Israel and the Middle East. John, first to you. After 4 elections, Israel finally formed a government. But it's a government never before seen in Israel, with parties across the political spectrum, including a party affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. It seemed the one unifying factor was parties who wanted to see Beniamin Netanyahu out of power. What do you make of this government, John? And since it's so diverse with competing agendas, can it last?
Yeah, you know, Chris, being here in the United States, one of the things that strikes me is there's an 800-pound gorilla, the proverbial gorilla, in the room in both Washington and in Jerusalem at this point in time. In Jerusalem, it's only been 6 months since Netanyahu was replaced as prime minister, and yet there seems to be this effort to prevent him from ever getting back. And it's the shadow of Netanyahu hangs over, probably because Likud won 30 seats in the last election, far more than any other party did, and so he's always there in the waiting room, so to speak. And at the same time in Washington, President Trump, it's only been a year, less than a year, since he was replaced by Joe Biden, and Trump is the eternal presence in Washington, D.C. It seems like every effort is being made to get after his aides, to go after something that would keep him from ever coming back to the office again. It seems like in both Washington and in Jerusalem, people are fearing or expecting that either one of them could come back next week.
Yeah. Julie, following up on John, you know, this government has had a lot to deal with, COVID, Iran, and many other issues. How do you think the government has managed for these last several months?
You know, Chris, I think a lot of Israelis are pretty disappointed with Naftali Bennett. People are not shouting his praises necessarily. On the other hand, he really has, you know, he's got a lot to deal with, like you said, the COVID, Iran, even the Abraham Accords. One thing is, though, he seems to, though he keeps saying what a great job he's done, now he's the first prime minister to meet with the leader of the UAE, but just about everything he's doing and listing as an accomplishment was started by Netanyahu. So he's kind of like riding on the coattails with the Abraham Accords, following the same tactic with Iran. Even with the COVID vaccines, like them, don't like them, whatever your opinion is on that, he's basically taking the same line and just following on with what Netanyahu did. I think, though, this government, that they're determined to stick together, and they do everything they can to be nice to each other and to keep things going. So we'll see where that leads.
Yeah, it does seem like that's the one thing that keeps them all together, is that they want to keep going on together, and they don't want to cause any internal disagreements that would make the government to fall. John, you know, the issue overriding the whole Middle East has been the potential of a nuclear Iran. How Israel is dealing with it is one issue, but how do you see the U.S.'s role in dealing with both Iran and then Israel?
Well, I don't think we can make any mistake about it, Chris. The representation of the Biden administration is a representation of an entirely different philosophy than President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu were forwarding. We were on a course where the Palestinians were being pushed to the side and Iran was being dealt with sanctions and the sense that the combined strength of the United States and Israel would keep Iran at bay. That's pretty much gone out the window. There's a lot of talk about, we're going to be tough with Iran, but the Biden administration wants to go back to the globalist position of negotiating with Iran, having a joint agreement, and also the globalist position of a two-state solution being moved back to the forefront. And so there's this constant give and take tension between this fragile coalition government in Israel and the Biden administration, which seems clearly determined to pull a 180 on almost everything Trump was doing, especially regarding Iran.
Julie, it seems Israeli political leaders and military leaders, they're increasing their public statements about striking Iran's nuclear sites. Do you agree that we're just seeing an increase of the rhetoric about possibly striking Iran's nuclear facilities?
Definitely, there's definitely an increase in the rhetoric. I mean, Israel, as you know, every few days it seems, or every couple weeks, they're saying, okay, now we have the plans ready. Okay, we have a timeline. Okay, now we're going to do this. And Iran has started to kind of fight back. They have published this map of sites they could hit in Israel. And it seems like things are heading towards an escalation. On the other hand, you know, Israel is already striking Iranian targets, although they won't say it, inside Syria. And we've seen that kind of ramp up recently. So it looks like things are heading towards an Israeli strike inside Iran. It looks like everything seems to be going bust with the nuclear agreement, and it could be very soon.
Well, John and Julie, it does seem like there's a crescendo of rhetoric about the possibility on striking Iran's nuclear program. When we come back, we'll talk about the Abraham Accords here in the Middle East and what that means for the region.
Alpha,